Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for tuning in to another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. As mentioned with the previous video, this is actually a video on two Romans as opposed to the traditional one Greek and one Roman. This is kind of just a structural decision that Plutarch made. He does Agis and Cleomenes, who are two Greeks, and then Tiberius and Caius Gracchus, who are two Romans, and then he compares all four. So we'll be doing a comparison of these two individuals and the two individuals from the former video in this one in aggregate today. So yeah, just wanted to point that out. Additionally, I know you might think this is a spelling error, Caius Gracchus. You might see Gaius Gracchus some places on the internet. Most of the older sources and like my older edition of Plutarch's Lives, which is by Arthur H. Clow, they use the C as opposed to the G. I just think it's more correct from what I've seen. I also like it because it's kind of similar to the spelling of my name, so I don't know, a little bit of narcissism there, or nepotism. But either way. Yeah, so I guess starting off with Tiberius. Actually Plutarch, I'll go through a brief overview of the two and do a little comparison here because that's how Plutarch structured it as well. So Tiberius and Gracchus, their father's name was Tiberius Gracchus. He was one-time censor, two-time consul, and he actually had two triumphs. So triumphs is, as I mentioned, kind of when you get to enter Rome with a big parade for winning a great achievement. So that their father was obviously a very powerful guy, and on the mother's side, their mother's name was Cornelia, and she was the daughter of Scipio Africanus, who was the legendary general who defeated, or consul who defeated Hannibal. So a very, very famous mother. Supposedly Tiberius, their father, didn't get along very well with Scipio Africanus, and there was a bad omen. In their bed, they found two snakes, one male snake and one female snake. And the soothsayer said that if Tiberius were to kill the female snake, Cornelia would die, and if he were to kill the male snake, he would die. Personally, I don't know why he didn't kill either of them, but he kills the male snake partially because fully for the love of his wife, and ultimately he ends up dying, and his wife Cornelia becomes the widow of their 12 children. Ultimately, only 3 of the children survive, but she cares for them very well. Plutarch says, even beyond the great virtue that these children were born with, Tiberius and Gracchus and their one sister, their training that their mother gave them even surpassed this great nature. As a testament to Cornelia's love for her children, she's even offered to marry Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, and she rejects it because she wants to dedicate her life to her children and maintain as a widow. So obviously a big investment from a mother to her children. In terms of temperament between Tiberius and Caius, Tiberius, the elder by 9 years, was much more gentle and composed, whereas Caius was earnest and vehement. Tiberius was a quiet and orderly speaker, and he stood still whenever making a speech, whereas Caius was much more loud and much more aggressive and had a much bigger temper. And he was known to walk around the assembly when making a speech and even getting up into the bleachers. It's said that Caius would sometimes lose his temper and start changing his pitch of speech. So he actually had a slave who had a little flute. So whenever he started to change his pitch, he would play like a note and he would kind of settle down to it. That's sort of an interesting anecdote. Tiberius in his personal life and at his dinner table was much more conservative and much more frugal, whereas Caius, and Plutarch does note that Caius was still actually very frugal and very not very opulent, but compared to Tiberius, he was a bit more extravagant. Like, he did buy these silver dolphins for his table, which was something Tiberius would never do. But he was definitely not extreme here. So I guess moving directly to Tiberius's life, and we'll get more into Caius's life, but just wanted to cover up their personalities first briefly. So he first sort of starts his career in Augur College, which is like a religious college. It said that it wasn't his great family or his uh, his famous family that got him into Augur College, but rather his actual own natural virtue. So that was kind of a plus for him in that regards. He marries, while at Augur College, he marries this woman named Claudia. Her father, Appius Claudius, was the leader of the Senate and was a former consul and censor, so a very, very powerful person in Rome. Um, when Appius Claudius heads home and tells his wife Antista that he has married off his daughter, she says, "But why so suddenly? Or what means this haste? Unless you have provided Tiberius Gracchus for her husband." So basically, what his wife is saying is that to marry her off so quickly would be irrational, unless it was such a great man as Tiberius Gracchus, and so it was. So, interesting anecdote there. His first sort of military endeavor is under the leadership of Scipio the Younger. So this is his uncle, his sister's husband, or sorry, his step brother. So he's fighting in Africa in the Third Punic War, which was once again against Carthage. He shared a tent with Scipio the Younger. Scipio Aemilius is also another name for him, probably just due because they're blood and Tiberius's famous family. But while there, he proves himself notorious amongst the soldiers for his excessive obedience. He's one of the most obedient people on the battlefield, but he also is one of the most courageous. When they are attacking a Carthaginian city, he wins the fame of many of the soldiers by being the first to climb up onto the wall, which is obviously a sign of bravery and perhaps undue risk considering his great family. And as we've seen, there are other lives here where they do take unnecessary risks like that, and it doesn't end so well. But Plutarch notes, like for example, Alexander is everyone loves Alexander and toots his horn all the time, but he could have died any day, so undue risk is not always good. But Tiberius obviously won the respect of his soldiers there. He next becomes a quaestor in Hispania, which is modern-day Spain, and the quaestor is kind of like a finance role, kind of like a CFO of the legion. And in the Numantine War, he's working under an individual named Caius Mancinus. And Caius Mancinus is not doing very well. Maybe it was just because the Hispanians or the Numantines were too powerful, but they're obviously losing the war off in Spain. So what Tiberius does is he negotiates a peace treaty. This is something that was not common for someone as a quaestor role, or not even allowed. It was usually meant for legislators, but nonetheless he does it because he has a good relationship with the Numantines, at the time their enemy. The peace treaty is not supported by everyone in Rome, especially the Senate and the wealthy class. They think it makes Rome seem weak, but it was sort of necessary, and most of the people agreed with that because many people were dying. At one point, the Numantines capture a Roman city, and they take all these spoils, and they take Tiberius's ledgers and his documents and papers. And they felt so bad, they actually invite Tiberius back to their city in Hispania, and they give him a big feast and give him all of his ledgers and all of his papers back, and even offer up some of the spoils back to Tiberius, which is very interesting, and it might lead one to think that Tiberius was maybe sided with the enemy because they were so nice to them. But Tiberius shows to be very prudent, and he doesn't take any of the spoils. All he takes is incense, kind of a tip of the hat to his previous career as an augur in Augur College, so a tip of the hat to his religious predisposition. This religious predisposition might have something to do with his temperance and his modesty, and obviously I think it did pretty good things for him. But at this point, there starts to be a little bit of a gap between him and his stepbrother, Scipio Aemilius. Scipio doesn't really support the peace treaty that he pushes, and he definitely doesn't support Caius Mancinus, but Plutarch notes that at this point, Scipio was still supporting him in the Numantine War, and there was no gap growing between them at this point. Going back to Rome, when he actually returns, there was serious issues occurring. Firstly, the legionnaires who joined the army, legionnaires were the soldiers, when they were fighting, they had to stay for the whole length of the conquest. So these conquests could get very drawn out and could continue almost indefinitely. So leaving their properties or their lands up to their families, their wives and children, many of them were forced to sell it to the wealthy landowners. And much of this land was now being inhabited by slaves rather than actual Romans, or foreign labor or barbarians, because the actual citizens of Rome could no longer afford to keep it. Tiberius kind of has his epiphany when he is marching to Numantine, and he sees this Roman farm, and it's full of just barbarians working there, and he figures that the original inhabitants, or the people who had the right to own that land, had lost it, and some corrupt capitalist had taken it and was using it, turning it into essentially a factory. Definitely not helping the people. So with this, he sort of strives to make changes in the legislation, and he also inspires his brother to later do so as well. He has this quote, and Plutarch notes at this time there was slaves marching throughout the Rome, and very few citizens were doing very well. Most of them were homeless, and the slaves were doing better, and obviously the slave owners were doing even better than them. He has this quote: "The wild beasts that roam over Italy have their dens. Each has a place of repose and refuge. But the men who fight and die for Italy enjoy nothing but the air and light. Without houses or home, they wander about with their wives and children." So he definitely sympathized with these poor ex-soldiers. Additionally, to add salt to the wound, the soldiers, once they lost their land, were no longer allowed to fight in the army, because to be a legionnaire you had to own land. And additionally, the taxes were only really accumulated from those who owned land. So taxes were not doing well, and the army was also shrinking because so many were just losing their land. Similar to what we saw in Aegeus and Cleomenes, there was a huge wealth gap. And obviously there are still wealth gaps today, but considering the size of Rome at the time, such wealth gaps were quite excessive. There was previously legislation, however, though, that each individual can only own 500 jugas of land, jugera of land, which is about 500 jugera is about 125 hectares. So they were restricted, and any excess lands had to be given to the state. But many of the wealthy landowners, or greedy capitalists you could call them, found loopholes, so they would hold these additional properties in other individuals' names or fictitious people's names, and then ultimately transfer the name. So sort of like sheltering their assets. So what he does is, he creates a couple allies. Firstly, Crassus, and Crassus we spoke about earlier. Crassus was the richest man in Rome. So it's interesting that Crassus was aligning himself with the populist or left-wing ideologies of Tiberius, despite being the richest man in Rome. My theory kind of is with this, and Plutarch also believes in it too, is that Crassus, once he was the richest man in Rome, he had already done that. He wanted to do something else, and he wanted to actually make a political career or achieve political successes. Once you are the richest person, where do you go from that? Like, to get more money, he was already hosting incredibly lavish parties, and he really actually wanted to make a difference in this regard. And he was also very crucial in creating the first triumvirate, which was an alliance between Pompey, Caesar, and him. So he prevented the ultimate collapse of the Roman Republic for many years. So Crassus is, despite being maybe the greediest capitalist, was also partial to the people. Additionally, and at the time, Crassus was Pontifex Maximus, so he was the religious leader of this town, or the city. So perhaps that's another reason why he aligned himself with Tiberius, because Tiberius had roots as in religious endeavors. He also aligns himself with Publius Mucius Scaevola, who was a consul and jurist, so a pretty powerful person in Rome. And thirdly, with his stepfather, or father-in-law, Appius Claudius, who was once the head of the Senate and also a consul and a censor. So 3 powerful people. So what they do is they know they can't just start taking all this land from the rich people, so they actually offer compensation to the wealthy people to return their lands in excess of 500 juguras to the state. And strangely enough, this is rejected because, well, for obvious reasons, they thought that firstly Tiberius was getting too powerful amongst the people, and they did not want to betray they're called the equites class. It pretty much went that there was the Senate, who was probably the highest class, then the equites, which is like the capitalists and the wealthy, and then the populares, the general people, or even lower would be like the plebeians. But populares would be plebeians as well. But either way, it's rejected, and one of the reasons is there's this guy named Marcus Octavius, who was a tribune, also a tribune. Tiberius at this time was a tribune, and tribunes had veto power, so they could cancel it. And one of the reasons why it was close to succeeding but ultimately failed is that Tiberius and his allies went only to the plebeian assembly rather than to the Senate. So they could push legislation through either avenue, but they pushed it through the plebeian assembly. It's interesting how pretty much all political systems are pretty much parallel. A plebeian assembly is like the lower house, which is like elected officials, whereas the Senate are appointed, like the upper house. You can see parallels in pretty much every political system. Most directly and most relevant right now is also in Sparta, as we saw in Aegis and Cleomenes. In ancient Sparta, they had the ephors, which were the elected officials, and the elders, who were appointed for life. So very similar, and we still see pretty much the same thing in most developed countries today. But either way, Marcus Octavius tries to veto this, but there's a temporary government shutdown because Tiberius tries to veto a ceremonial event. So there's a government shutdown, and we see this a lot in modern day politics, particularly most recently in the United States. And ultimately, Octavius is removed from government. So a lot of people see this as Tiberius becoming tyrannical, and they think that Tiberius wants to be king. And king sort of had a very bad image at this time in Rome. They hadn't had after eliminated the Tarquins, who were the last royal family of Rome, and King Attalus the third being removed, they really had a hate for kings. So to call someone or to claim that someone had intents of becoming a king is quite an insult, and obviously a tactful effort on behalf of the Senate. With this, though, Tiberius still is in government, however, and he gets his legislation through, so they are starting land redistributions, and they start giving 30 jugera to the homeless ex-legionnaires, or just the homeless generally. So these people now also are paying taxes, and now they're definitely going to vote for Tiberius because they believe in what he has done. And similarly, they can also fight in the army again, and they're paying taxes. But unfortunately, Tiberius, in pushing this legislation, it's run mostly by his family, and this is where Caius starts working for him at this time, in doing this land redistribution efforts. But they had very little support on behalf of the Senate, and they start making a great amount of enemies. Eventually, a skirmish breaks out. Some supporters of Tiberius start fighting with supporters of the Senate and the wealthy, and Tiberius really starts worrying that something might happen. So he doesn't actually have direct bodyguards, but he always sort of has a swarm of supporters who are always there to protect him. Eventually, Flaccus, who is later an ally of Caius, and is just an ally of the two brothers throughout their whole time, Flaccus, we call him by his first name, Flavius perhaps. He informs him that the Senate is starting to arm slaves and men, and with clubs and staves, or mostly just clubs and rocks, actually. And I find this is an important detail because they were not swords. If they were armed with swords, I would have thought there would be more ex-military and stuff, but it was more the slaves and more the upper class who were arming themselves, not the lower class who were arming themselves against them. The slaves were obviously lower class, but they're the lowest of the low, and they were pretty much just auxiliaries to the wealthy. Eventually, the one who really starts the leading to the death of Tiberius is his cousin, Publius Nasica. So they're attacking during the skirmish. Tiberius does this gesture with his head, and I have a hard time imagining what it is, but I think he kind of goes like this, and what he's saying is that he's fearing for his life. But Publius Nasica goes to who was at the time Pontifex Maximus. He goes to the Senate and tells them that Tiberius wants to be king by doing that gesture, and that's what he was signaling. So the consul refuses, but regardless, his cousin sends off an army to go and attack him. And eventually he's beaten to death with pieces of benches, so just sticks and rods. And the first one to do it his name was Satirius, gives the first blow, who is the fellow tribune. So at any point there was two tribunes in Rome, so his essentially who should have been his partner, obviously a dysfunctional government if the one kills the other. But additionally, 300 are killed with stones and clubs, and they're thrown into the river Tiber, so they get no burial. Plutarch says this is the first outbreak of civil strife, and it kind of starts alluding to the ultimate civil wars that come later, specifically the social war. There's many arrests and executions of supporters, and notably some individuals are put into bags with poisonous vipers, so pretty horrible way to die. But ultimately Nasica is really shamed because despite all the people that they do kill, most of the general people, or especially the people who owed their lands to Tiberius, really hate what they've done, and the Senate is sort of forced to approve of the agrarian reforms. So some of these agrarian reforms do stay, and his legacy does in some way last. At the very end, his brother-in-law Scipio criticizes Tiberius's laws, and whenever Scipio Aemilius or Scipio the Younger tried to speak in any occasion, they would interrupt him in his speech. So just kind of shows that Tiberius still had a lot of supporters and had definitely laid the foundation for his brother. I guess just to finish up with the stuff on this, don't be confused by this John Leech comic. It's a critique at the British government. This is supposed to be Tiberius wearing a top hat, so it's a juxtaposition in that Tiberius is actually for the people, whereas at the time the government of Britain were corrupt. So a little complex, and the context had to be noted because Tiberius was pretty much the opposite of a top hat wearer, like Mr. Monopoly. And here's another quote by Blasius, a very famous man in Rome. If such a man as Tiberius had ordered such a thing, it would also have been right for me to do it. For Tiberius would not have given such an order if it had not have been for the interests of the people. So interesting that Tiberius came from such a wealthy family and from the Optimates, and changed so much for the better. So moving on to his brother. So obviously much more aggressive, and it's said that the grief he had suffered from seeing his brother die, his brother was only 9 years older than him, encouraged him to speak out fearlessly whenever he had lamented the fate of his brother. So he didn't feel like he had much to lose. His brother was dead. He had already lost 9 siblings previously too, so he really started to care for the cause. And his first, obviously, as I mentioned, his first interaction with politics was as a land commissioner working under his brother. And then he becomes a quaestor in Sardinia. So once again, a quaestor is like a finance role. But there he proves to be a great orator and becomes famous for his oratory abilities. Here's a really, I think, beautiful image of him giving some sort of oration. I imagine this is Rome, but based on the low density of buildings, I'm not sure where it would be, but I think it's just a really cool looking image. One of the things I was going to mention it later, but I'll just say it now on the topic of his oration. It used to always be that after giving a speech, they would turn their head to the right towards the curie, but instead he started turning his head to the left towards the assembly, the general people. So it was just kind of his way of turning. It's essentially he turned his back on the Senate, and it was pretty much representative of his whole career and that of his brothers. So he proved. He eventually becomes tribune, and prior to that in Sardinia, he has to leave the army at one point, and the Senate accuses him of neglecting his post, but he is quick to point out that he served 2 years longer, 12 years as opposed to 10 years, and that he served as quaestor as 2 years as opposed to 1. So just kind of a minute detail and kind of a technical thing, but it's a testament to his ability of being a great orator, because he turned this loss and this critique from the Senate in a way to win himself tribuneship, which he does. So he wins tribune, and one of the things that he notes is that the tribunes are not getting enough respect. This is probably just because the Senate was demanding all the respect. And he cited 2 examples. One time a war was starting with the Farii over disrespect to his Senate. And he also cites another time a individual was killed for not making way for a senator, or for a tribune. So yeah, kind of strange, 2 little anecdotes, but I think it's just testament to his aggressive nature and dislike for the Senate. So while tribune, the first things he does is he reforms the judiciary. So magistrates that were deposed could not run again. So these things, and the next thing was that the right to persecute any magistrate for exile, without trial. So if a magistrate gave to an individual exile without trial, they could be persecuted. So these 2 things were just directly as a result of the aftermath of the death of Tiberius. They had issues on both regards, so he made some reform there. The courts could not, of capital punishment, so could not be set up by people illegally. So this was just, once again, in the aftermath of Tiberius, they didn't actually establish a court of capital punishment, but these courts of capital punishment could only be established by the people, not by the Senate, so by the majority, which definitely makes sense to me. But the argument of capital punishment is a deep conversation, which I'd be willing to debate anyone or discuss with anyone that would be willing to. I think it's a fun one, next to abortion. Those are cool conversations. Yeah, anyway, so he implements also Lex Acilia, which they put extortion trials are done by the equities class. So this is where he sort of differs from his brother. So Tiberius pretty much made enemies of both the equities class, as I mentioned, the landowners and the wealthy, and the senators. So he had 2 enemies, whereas Caius made sure that he befriended the equities class and just attacked the Senate. So he had made more allies in the making. And one of the first things he did was he allowed the equities class to be in charge of extortion trials. He changed, in the taxation of Asia, which was recently conquered land, he allowed the equities class to execute the the taxation there. So they were pretty much self-regulating there, which was obviously a risky blow. And the taxation was changed from a fixed rate to 10%. So supposedly this actually ultimately ended up rendering more tax revenue, but it won the respect of the equities class because those who were super rich didn't really care too much about the tax, whereas those who were poor would have preferred something like a percent rather than a fixed rate. Another thing he implements is lux fumentoria. So this was probably one of the most notable things in all of Rome, and the most lasting of what he does was the government was required to buy bulk grain from North Africa and Sicily and distribute it among the citizens at a low price as monthly rations. So this was something that really helped the people, and similar to how Tiberius gave land to the people who were directly getting food from Caius were obviously likely to vote for him and support him because, what's more important than food and land, no matter what sort of rhetoric they offer. Additionally, he implements lux militaris, which gives free clothing to soldiers and equipment, and it shortened the length of military service. And most of all, it forbade the draft of boys under the age of 17. So I think a lot of people think of Rome as like a bunch of, or at least I thought, people were obviously matured much earlier because the education system was lesser. So people were like fighting wars when they were 14. Most of the soldiers were at least 17 or older. So they were not a bunch of youths running around killing each other at the peak of their development. Another thing that he does, and most importantly, and this sort of starts foreshadowing the ultimate social war, is he creates a bill to include all Latins as citizens. So at the time, a lot of people didn't have the full rights, even though they might have lived in Rome at the time. But this was rejected by the Senate, and this is ultimately one of the main reasons that the social war was caused, putting aside just the gap between Sylla and Marcius. But obviously, a big part of the social war was a lot of people getting citizens, and one of the citizenship, and that's one of the, women's suffrage or the March on Washington for the Black movement. Very, very easy things for people to stand behind and support, just getting the rights as people. So the Senate starts backing this individual named Livius Drassus. So he was also running for tribune and ultimately does get it, and he pretty much undermines Caius in every single one of his endeavors. But he always seems to lag behind him in one step, so he doesn't win any respect. Drassus, the Senate told him, don't go completely contradictory to Caius because that would just make him as big of an enemy as the Senate was, but to do the same sort of strategy, which was, I think, a very dumb method. For example, when Caius said that all Latins should have citizenship, Drassus pushed the legislation that Latins could not be beaten with rods. So, obviously, the Latins would rather be citizens than not be beaten by rods, albeit they would still not like to be beaten by rods, but it just sort of proved to be fruitless legislation. But ultimately, Caius leaves Rome to found a colony in Carthage that his brother-in-law had destroyed. So this kind of takes him out of the political sphere for a bit, and Drassus uses this as an opportunity to attack him and his ally Flavius Flaccus, who was also a supporter of Tiberius. Then Scipio Aemilius dies, and Gaius and his family are accused of this death, which I think is a little bit undue. Obviously, he didn't do it because he was off in Carthage founding a city, but it's his brother-in-law, and I think it would be despite Scipio Aemilius sort of trash talking his older brother and him, he obviously I don't think would have gone so far as to kill him. But this sort of it was just essentially slander, but no one really believed it. Then what he does is, when he moves back, the first thing he does is he moves from the Palatine to the Forum. So he moves, the Senate and rich people lived in what's called the Palatine. It's like a wealthy district. And he moves to the Forum to live more amongst the people. This did twofold. At first, they reiterated his dedication to the people over that of the Senate, but it also put him closer to safety, because these people were willing to protect him and fight for him, whereas living amongst the Senate, he could have been easily assassinated like his brother. What the Senate does, and probably a pretty risky move, but or pretty harsh move, is they order all non-Romans to be removed from the city, because they realize all these non-Romans would be obviously partial to Caius, because Caius was trying to get them citizenship. But even then, Caius seems to not be able to win here. He doesn't put up a big enough fight, so he gets criticized here, and he even stands by as his own friend, who was a non-citizen, gets dragged out of the city. So, but he thought if he were to put up a fight now, he would probably dilute his entire efforts and put himself at risk of assassination. One of the last things he really does that really sort of upsets the Senate is that he wants to have all the seats removed from the gladiator arena so that the general population could actually join, because the seats were restrictive in terms of number. And they said no, and they refused it, but he went in during the night and removed the seats himself. So I think that was a pretty good thing of him to do. Apparently during this, he doesn't win tribuneship, because they were so upset by this and all of his previous actions that they falsified the elections, falsified the ballots, and he does not win tribune. It said his mother at this point hired a harvester as a secret bodyguard for Caius. Just a little note to bring back to his mother's love and support for him, but obviously, as we'll see, it's probably not quite enough. Things really start breaking out, so Caius was really trying to not upset them too much, as he didn't put up a big a fight when all the non-citizens were being removed. But an individual named Quintus Antilius gives him an indecent gesture. There's a big mob in the street, and he gives him an indecent gesture. I don't know what that would actually look like. As I said, we don't even know what the actual Roman salute looks like, because there are no direct images. The actual one that we perceive today, the straight arm, or that we also see saw in Nazi Germany, was actually established by 18th century France in a later painting. But either way, Quintus Antilius gives him an indecent gesture, and he's killed by Caius's mob. So Caius does not do it himself, but the Senate and wealthy class are outraged by this. One of the things that he doesn't do is he doesn't exonerate this action, though. He just heads home with his ally Flaccus, or Flavius Flaccus, and sort of waits it out to see what occurs. Flavius actually wants to start a war with them. So what he does is, Flavius and Caius supported this, but he sends his own son carrying a staff. And in Rome, if one was carrying a staff, that was like they would carry a staff to start a war. But Caius wanted no such thing. There were parties starting, and the Senate declared Caius enemy of the state, and they grant this individual Oppimus the rights, a senatorial decree to eradicate tyrants from the city. So with this decree, he's allowed to build up an army and approach Caius and Flavius. So Flavius actually kind of puts up more of a fight on the streets. His first son is captured, and then eventually he hides in a bathhouse with his eldest son is killed. The allies at first did not want to tell Oppimus where, and the Senate where he was hiding, Flavius was hiding, but they threatened to burn down the whole street, so they gave up his location, and he was killed. Meanwhile, Caius didn't really put up a fight. Firstly, he runs to the Temple of Diana, and he tries to commit suicide, and all of his friends tell him don't. He has a greater purpose. But then once the people approach, he runs off again, and more of his friends die in protecting him. And he sort of, I think, rationalizes that, his staying alive is, causing the death of a lot of his friends. And he eventually kills himself over a bridge. The Optimus demands or offers a bounty to collect his dead head, which ended up being surprisingly 17 2/3 pound, 2 of a pound. So I don't know, just a kind of a random detail. I don't even think 17 2/3 pounds is very heavy, but I think it was these important notes are worth carrying over. So I guess people thought maybe he was so smart, and it was worth remembering, or at least we still talk about it 2,000 years later. So, but either way, the guy who takes the head cuts the brain out and fills it with molten lead and doesn't even receive the bounty. So despite him having many supporters, many people didn't, and there were still many cruel people in Rome. Ultimately, 3,000 were killed in this endeavor, mostly as a result of Flavius. Caius kind of wanted a peaceful end to it, and he killed himself in that regards. The wives were forbidden to mourn, but Optimus even puts a temple in the Concord, which was considered a very cruel thing to do because so many citizens died. And Plutarch says that Optimus was the first to make himself dictator. So in Rome, on many occasions, individuals were elected as dictators, specifically most notably in the Punic Wars against Carthage. But to make oneself dictator, Optimus was the first one to do that. And we'll see that many times later by Sylla, Marius, Julius Caesar. And yeah, he sort of set a precedent here, and we're starting to get quite close to that time. The only thing that really stayed of Caius and most of his legislation was overturned, but the Roman bread dole maintained, but the rest was really repealed. So yeah, moving on to the comparison, the aggregate comparison. I don't know how much you remember from the Aegis and Cleomenes stories, but they were essentially similar. Sparta was in a decline, and they wanted to reestablish the sort of socialist policies and eradicate the wealth gap at the time. So starting off with differences, Aegis and Cleomenes, when they came into power in Sparta wasn't doing very well. They had lost the Peloponnesian War, and they were pretty much like a second-rate state, far from their former glory. Whereas when the Gracchi brothers, Caius and Tiberius, Rome was doing pretty well, or especially well considering compared to during the Second Punic War, the Third Punic War, they were doing pretty well. Hannibal was dead, and things later get much worse in the social war. So it was a pretty good time for them to be doing this. Additionally, the Aegis and Cleomenes, Plutarch says they had a stronger natural gift, whereas the Gracchi had better training. Their mother was very good to them, and they were gifted in that regards. Aegis and Cleomenes completely flipped over the legislation. They completely changed the government, whereas Tiberius and Gracchus Caius sort of just made many legislatory reforms. Plutarch says it's kind of like cutting off the heads of the Hydra. Although they fixed many things temporarily, nothing really lasted. But same could be said for Aegis and Cleomenes. Neither either lasted. But Plutarch believes that to really make a long-lasting change, they had to completely flip the government on its head, sort of what in the way Aegis and Cleomenes did. Additionally, Aegis and Cleomenes sort of had history to support them. Lycurgus was the famous lawgiver of Sparta, and many people were still partial to the old ways, whereas Tiberius and Caius didn't really have any support or history to back themselves up. They had a history of kings, which they were often related to, and they didn't really have history to fall back on. In terms of their death, the Gracchi, Plutarch says, both tried to keep living. But I disagree. I think Caius, like, he kind of put himself to death earlier than he could have. He probably could have kept running. But then again, at that time, not many people were willing to support him. So I guess he did put up a bit of a fight, and he did support Flavius in putting up a fight. Whereas Agis and Cleomenes both expedited their deaths. Agis sort of has a Socrates-like death where he refuses to speak and lets the enemy kill him, whereas Cleomenes actually just kills himself off quite early in fear. So a little different in that regards. In terms of military pursuits, Plutarch always compares them. None of these four are really the greatest in terms of military in Plutarch's lives, but he says Caius was number one in terms of military pursuits. Cleomenes and Tiberius were about parallel. They both had about one great success. Caius didn't even have that many, but he proved to be pretty good. I actually think Tiberius might have been better than Caius because he proved more bravery, but it was only on that one real occasion where he climbed the wall. But Agis was definitely the lesser, so in terms of military, he was more, he never killed a single soul. And additionally, on that, Agis was sort of left a lot of the work to Agesilaus and Lysander. Agesilaus and Lysander sort of got his rival removed, whereas Agis sort of sat back and was sort of more the leader of thought rather than the leader of action. Whereas Cleomenes killed 4 out of the 5 ephors and committed a lot of great murder. So Cleomenes was probably the most harsh here. Plutarch kind of sums it up, all 4 of them, like this. He said Tiberius had the best virtue. I think we could say that, in his priestly-like nature and his frugality. Agis had the least weaknesses or least wrongdoings. He did nothing really wrong. He was just the leader of thought and leader in terms of inspiration, but never a murderer. And then he says Cleomenes was more bold than Caius. So I don't know why he kind of contradicts himself. Maybe Cleomenes was. He definitely says Caius was the better soldier, but he sort of throws Caius under the bus here. He says, Tiberius was the best in virtue, Agis was the least wrong, Cleomenes was more bold than Caius. But going back to the original discussion at the start of the other video, where everything is sort of like a balance, I think maybe he subtly was implying this. Caius might not have been the most bold, or he might not have done the least wrong or had the best virtue, but he might have been the best combination of the 3. So one doesn't need to be on one end of the spectrum to be the best. But I'm in no way saying he is the best. I think they were all great in their own different respects. In terms of similarities, there are many, so I'll do them quite quick. They were all very left-wing, populist, very against the wealthy, the optimates, or the elders. But interestingly enough, they all came from wealthy or powerful families, so they had every reason not to be. So sort of kind of alluding to the discussion on Crassus, maybe it was that since they had every capacity to be so powerful, they sympathized more with the general population. So I wrote this down. They came from wealth and power, but chose to share it. So, that's the 4 individuals. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one and the former ones as well. Thanks so much. Bye.